My first question is, how can Christians think theologically about the music that they encounter in everyday life?
Well, I think to begin with, there's very little written on this, and it's now a growing area. People getting very interested, and quite rightly so, because music's always been part of humankind as long as we've known it. So you in every culture, in every society, you'll find something like music. So we do as Christians, I think we need to think through now what is this music? What's it doing? How can we approach it in a Christian way? So what I say when I'm teaching this subject in classes is I say there's a question that's not allowed from now on in the whole course. And that's the question, do I like it? And the reason for putting it that way is because we live in a culture that suggests that's the first and the last question you could ever ask about, well, any art, but particularly music. And the implication is if you don't like it, then don't bother with it, dismiss it, take it off your playlist and have nothing to do with it. And what I tried in the class to inculcate is a different question, which is what's going on here? And that could apply to many other art forms as well. What's happening here? What is this musician or composer trying to do, as far as we can tell? What's this music doing in this situation? So you're curious about what's happening. That you may like it or not like it, putting all those things to the side. And then following from that, how can I learn from it as a Christian? How can I respond to it in a Christian way? How can I listen to it with Christian ears? And so first we ask sort of, what is it? What's going on? And then we say, now, how can I approach that in a Christian way? I think that will go with any art form. But the taste question is so dominant in so much thinking about music in our culture and sometimes in Christian culture. So I think that's the first thing. And then a number of questions follow out of that. I found it's very good to ask what dimension of Christian truth is being addressed here, although that might not come from a Christian, from a Christian composer or musician or performer or whatever. What dimension of Christian truth or the gospel or the Bible can this help me understand and experience? An example, I'm working with a student here at the moment, very bright student who's working on rap in hip hop culture. And he's read huge amounts about this. And he's been doing work with an Old Testament scholar who's very much an expert on the Psalms and the Psalms of lament and protest in particular. And he's found extraordinary commonalities between these two, though a great deal of rap does not mention God directly or have any particular theological intention. What you're getting very often in rap is a sophisticated form of poetic expression that can be protest, sometimes lament, great deal of anger, sometimes even very negative thoughts about others of the sort that you get pretty regularly in the Psalms. And then you think, well, this music and poetry, because it's both, has come out of a condition where people are seriously disadvantaged, like so many of the Psalms. So through this medium, we begin to see and understand and even experience more of what the psalmist sees, understands, and experiences. And that can be enormously illuminating. So that instead of, I don't mind rap. I wouldn't sort of spend money to listen to it. But you see, if I ask what's going on here and what dimension of Christian truth can I learn about through it, that's a different kind of question. And then all sorts of things open up. And of course, we just look at the Bible, look at the sheer range of emotions, of attitudes, and anger and joy and sorrow and doubt and all these things are all there in the Psalms. So much music over the last, well, even just the last 200 or 300 years has explored all of those emotions even when God is not being mentioned, it's explored those emotional states and what it's like to feel those things. And therefore, music can be a very powerful way of helping us, as it were, live into the very things that the Bible is speaking about, which of course involves setting all that in a theological or Christian context. And I think the other thing to ask, along with what dimensions of Christian truth or gospel can I learn about, the other thing is, what can I learn about the culture I'm living in? All music, to some extent, will reflect or express what's going on in a particular cultural group. Not always. Sometimes it's indirect. Sometimes it's very direct. But if we're not listening to the music of the culture and asking what's going on here, it's quite likely we'll miss out a great deal of the very culture that we seek, in which we seek to bear witness to the gospel. Rap again would be another good example of that, but also much more up your street, Luke. I mean, in Britain we had a fair amount of near-nihilist art at one stage, and of course everyone was up in protest and arms about it. But the question is, why on earth do they feel they need to produce this kind of art, and why does it raise so much, involve so much money? Also, another thing, again, in your field and Jonathan Anderson's field, they notice a huge amount of interest in, let's call it broadly, religion, spirituality, in connection with visual art. And so same goes with music to a certain extent. I think we need to be wary of not jumping on that too much and saying, well, all we need to do is add a bit of Christian varnish and then it'll all be okay. But we at least need to listen. What is being yearned for there? Or what is being protested against? What are they trying to escape, avoid, circumvent by using that kind of language, the so-called return of religion in visual art? So we learn a heck of a lot about the culture through music, and let's have our ears open to that before we say, I don't like it or I like it.
Early on, you mentioned the looking at everything theologically, and with that comes the possibility or the potential that as we listen to anything that sort of enters our ears culturally, that we can learn more about God through that. So not just learning about the culture, but also learning something. Maybe sometimes we'll call that general revelation, like learning God through the voices of the people that he has created. And obviously, as you mentioned with the Psalms, in almost universally less than ideal circumstances, but yet God is still present in these things. So maybe using the example of rap or otherwise, how do we learn God? How do we know him through these flawed experiences?
Ooh, huge question. I was in a hotel not so long ago, and the assistant restaurant manager came up and said that she was writing a book because I was writing, sketching something for a book in the with my laptop there, and I said, "What's the book about?" And she said, "How to Find God." So here we go. How to find God through. Well, I think let's take one aspect of that. We have to be, of course, what's going on throughout. Or ought to be going on, is that Scripture is orienting us towards supremely Jesus Christ. And that's happening within a community called the church. So it's not as if any time God language is used, we can assume, oh yeah, this is the God of Jesus Christ. But we were constantly oriented that direction. So if we're looking for signs of this God in culture at large, let's make sure it's this God that we're oriented towards, and not jump on every bit of spiritual or religious language that happens to come along. Nor must we be careful of not saying, because music gives me a great experience, oh, that must be a religious experience, that must be a direct encounter with God. That won't follow either. So we're constantly oriented through Scripture to the God of Jesus Christ. That's the first thing. But within that orientation, I have found that music can unlock all sorts of aspects of Christian truth in a way, in my own teaching of theology, that's proved very fruitful. For instance, in jazz, for instance, we've got a great jazz unit here at Duke, and a fantastic bass player that I've worked with quite a bit. The very dynamic of improvisation involves an interplay between the given, like the chord pattern or whatever it is, and the things that are unpredictable. The improvisation, the fact that you can't tell exactly what note is going to come next. So there's a kind of novelty, but it's faithful novelty. It's faithful to what is given. That interplay, it seems to me, it played out in sound, is an extraordinarily powerful way of understanding and to some extent experiencing the interplay between God's faithfulness and God's novelty in the spirit. Theologically, you could say between word and spirit. So yes, God has given us in Christ all we need, but the Spirit improvises on that truth in ever different ways and ever different situations, faithfully. And we need to live in the interplay between faithfulness and novelty. I think about worship, it's the same thing. People get anxious about liturgy, but in fact, every worship service has a form of some sort. It's not completely random. You have, when someone comes to a church, they've been coming to some time, they know there's going to be roughly this kind of structure, but they'll know also that things are going to be different. It'll be slightly different to him. The sermon won't be like it was last time. They may say this prayer again, but it probably says a different thing to them now that they're saying it a week later. So it is the Spirit taking this form or structure, whatever, but improvising it appropriately in different situations. That's where that dynamic is built into all music, of course, not just jazz. Even very, very notated, prepared music. When the performers are up there in the concert hall, they'll never play it the same way. They may decide to stretch out a phrase or to contract it or play something a bit louder this time or whatever. They're improvising for the occasion. Improvisation has always been built into one sort or another. It's just that the art of jazz, as it were, brings that interplay right out there, and we delight and love it. I often point out to people, some of the great composers, like Bach, for instance, we think of him as just the notator, but he was in many circles easily as well known as an improviser as he was a composer. And people used to toss themes to him and say, off you go. Same with Mozart, fantastic improviser. Beethoven, famous improviser. It's only, particularly in the late 19th and 20th centuries, that the art of improvisation in the so-called classical world has very much died. Well, not died, it's suppressed, let's say. Okay, so that's another example that I've often used is to contrast the way we hear the world with the way we see the world and what this can tell us about the Trinity. So if a painter comes along with a pot of red paint and paints a splodge on the canvas, and then comes along with a pot of yellow paint, paints over the red, if the red's dry, then the yellow will hide the red. Or it could be the other way around. The red could hide the yellow. And if the paint's wet, they merge into a new color, namely orange. The way we see the world means that we can't see different objects in the same space at the same time as different. Now, you can say, look, inside that, there's red and yellow. Yeah. And of course, there are many brilliant artists. Paul Klee would be one, would he not, who's evoked the experience of many colors in the one space. But actually, if you analyze close up the paintings, no, in our visual field, things have bounded spaces. They have edges so that you can't have them together and still visible as two different things. Our visual field is full of objects that have edges, so you can say a thing is there, but it's not there. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it has some limitations. in the world we hear, it's very different. So if you have a sound, if I play a note on a piano, what you actually hear fills the whole of your heard space. You don't say of the note you hear, it's here, but it's not there. That wouldn't make any sense. You can say it's coming from over there. Yeah, but what you actually hear fills that whole space. Sounds don't occupy little bounded locations. They fill the space. And then, of course, you add another sound, another note. That fills the same space, but you hear it as different. And if you add another, say, 3-note chord, you will hear all of those together in the same space, but they are irreducibly distinct, not separate, but distinct. So they have a kind of threeness and oneness there within the space that you hear. And that, it seems to have enormous implications. For instance, in John's Gospel, we hear that the Father is in the Son and the Son is in the Father. And yet the Father is not the Son and the Son is not the Father. They're not simply identical. How do you get your head around that? It's very hard to paint. And I've started painting myself, by the way. I have nothing against painting. It's very hard to paint, but it's incredibly easy to hear, because when you play two notes together, they are sounding through each other. They are in each other, yet irreducibly distinct. And so I found this with agnostics, atheists, in colleges, schools, whatever. I've just found this opens up a very different imagination. And a great deal of our struggles with the Trinity, I think, have been due to over-relying on a visual way of understanding the world. That doesn't make sound better than vision or something. That's not what I'm saying at all. The problem so often in Christian history is when we over-stress or over-depend on a particular sense to do all the work for us. When this is just, as it were, sitting there in our ears, just waiting, waiting to be exploited. And all sorts of other wonderful things come out of that, like, for instance, resonance, in a 3-note chord, the sounds are enhancing each other. They're not just sitting alongside each other. They're not tolerating each other. They're helping each other become more the sounds that they are or were made to be. That's what's happening in a 3-note chord. With 3 strings mating, you'll get what's called sympathetic resonance. That seems to me a very powerful metaphor for the Trinitarian life as well. It's the Father, Son, and Spirit are not 3 individuals sitting alongside each other and merely tolerating each other or talking across a distance or something. No, the Father loves the Son, and in so loving the Son is fully the Son's own self, so that there's mutual interplay, there's mutual enhancement. You can push it very much further than that, but that's the kind of gist. So I found in teaching Trinitarian doctrine, if we begin to hear things through sound and hear the world and not just see it, some of the perennial difficulties of Trinitarian doctrine begin to look a little less. There's still a great mystery, but still look a little less problematic, let's say.
Yeah, that's incredible. And maybe even that problem or that struggle with the Trinity that is maybe historically present throughout the history of theology is often has been negotiated via text, primarily via the mind and via rationality and rational argument. So you're sort of arguing for a more expansive understanding of even what theology is, or how it's opened up.
I think that, and involves the whole of us. Of course, I don't want to be anti-text, because the Trinitarian doctrine is expressed in text, and they realize their language is cracking open. It's the text, John's Gospel, that push us to reimagine the world in a different way. It's the texts that are bearing witness to something that needs music, poetry, painting, drama, or whatever, needs that in order that it can really take root in us. And that's That's happened from the beginning. From the beginning, they were singing, for goodness sake. From the beginning, they were painting images and pictures. It just happened. It just happened. So that's not to leave the text behind. It's to say, let's take these texts seriously, but don't think we can do all the work and explaining or understanding them in text. We need these other modes of knowing. I think this is what you're saying, look, other modes of knowing, other modes of experiencing the world, in order to bring to glorious light what's there in the text and what the texts are trying to tell us.
Yeah.
And we need visual art to do that as well. Of course we do.
Mm-hmm.
There's all sorts of things you can do in visual art you could never do in music.
Yeah.
We need drama as well. Of course we do. But what is Scripture telling us if it's not a drama? This is Kevin Van Hooser's work. Mm-hmm. We have things you can do, therefore, in drama you cannot do in any other form. Mm-hmm. God's given us these capacities, these abilities. Let's use them. Mm-hmm. And very often we therefore thought that witness and apologetics and teaching doctrine can only be done in the one way, via merely text and merely speaking. Mm-hmm. Critically important as those are.
Absolutely. And so much of our music has been this hybrid, as much as we think of music as oftentimes popularly, the sound and the text or the language sort of merged together, that they are two.
Exactly. I often say this in teaching worship. We think, say when you hear a sermon, all you're doing is hearing words. No, you're seeing a preacher. Mm-hmm. And that preacher will often have body language and there's a sound of the voice hugely affects what you're receiving. Mm-hmm. You might be doing it in a cold church rather than a warm church. You might do a dark church rather than a light church. There might be stained glass windows. There might not. There might be a dreadful picture there that you can't get your eyes off. There might not. All of these things, any psychology of perception will tell you, all of these things are affecting what you're hearing. This is what the frustration of the preacher sometimes, I do a lot of preaching myself, is you think you've proclaimed the truth, and perhaps you have, but it's not been received because of all these other things that go with it. And you're right, with music never comes on its own. It comes certainly with what you see. It very often comes with texts in most worship. It comes with memories, associations, all sorts of stuff it comes with. And so we need now multimedia theory of worship. It's or theology of worship. In the days when they started teaching worship courses in colleges and seminaries, a worship course usually turned out to be a history of liturgical texts. This is what they said. This is what they preached. But wait a minute, they said it within a building that was designed in a certain way. Arches or no arches, with a resonance or no resonance. The processions, as it's drama. I didn't say all this to you, so I'm saying visual art. So now more and more people are saying, we're going to understand the worship of the past. We have to understand it not just in terms of the words they used, important as that is, in terms of the setting in which those words took place. Very, very important.
Yeah. And even more broadly, I'm thinking even of David Byrne's book, How Music Works, and then sort of discussing the history of music through the spaces that it fills. Yeah,
it's a very good book. Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, history of music isn't just the history of scores or texts. After all, music was not written down until about 1000 AD. For the first 1,000 years of the Christian church, no one thought of writing music down, which is an extraordinary thought. Yeah. So it's ludicrous to say the history of music, you can just be a history of scores. That's one thing, and you go to traditional music degree, that's what they'll be focused on probably. That's all right, but let's remember, even geographically now, most music happens very often without notation at all. Mm-hmm. It's a practice. People make sounds and they receive sounds or hear them or listen to whatever. That's what's happening in a social and cultural situation. And And that's when you begin to understand what music is doing, not just by studying a score, important as that is. Yeah. If everyone was as wise as you and me, the world would be a lot happier, wouldn't it?
That's what I tried to tell everybody. Then
I know, but for some reason I can't convince anyone else of that. I know the feeling.
Well, speaking of your wisdom, I've really appreciated the way that you do use words and record them in the text that you've published, and some really important work that, as you mentioned, hasn't really happened in the past in Christendom or otherwise, to really give that kind of space and that weight to music and the arts in general as theological practice, or as a place to learn theology and flesh it out, maybe. So I'd be curious to know what you're working on now, or what you've worked on recently that's sort of on your mind.
Well, thank you very much for what you said. I think you're being overgenerous, but the book that I've just finished, will be finished in another 2 weeks, is a book on the arts and reductionism. Reductionism is the tendency to flatten everything onto one type of explanation. So we say human beings are nothing but, and you just list the chemicals, or the universe is nothing but atoms and subatomic particles jostling in random fashion. Once you've boiled everything down, that's what the reductionists want to do, boil everything down to one type of thing and one type of explanation. And that can happen. It can happen all sorts of ways. I mean, you can have economic reductionism, where you say, in the last resort, everything's about economics and money. You can explain all human behavior in terms of finance, or all human behavior in terms of psychology. You're a Christian only because you're psychologically wired that way, or because your parents were, or because you were brought up in this culture, or whatever. That's another form of reductionism. There are lots of them around. And I think it's a very dangerous thing. But what I'm trying, and from a Christian point of view, it will eventually lead to the exclusion of God, of course, because you're trying to get down just to one kind of reality, and usually that means physical reality and nothing else. So it's a profoundly anti-Christian, when it's taken to its extremes, an anti-Christian pressure, I think. What I try to show in the book is that the arts have a crucial role in resisting this tendency towards reductionism, because the arts, by their very nature, keep telling us there's more here than you think. So an example, if I may, in the face of an expert, I hesitate to do this, but an example I often use is the difference between a picture of shoes on the side of a shoebox you get at a shoe store, and Van Gogh's picture of the farmer's shoes. It's become quite famous, where it's an extraordinary picture of just two shoes, but they're full of mud and earth, and they're bent, and the shading is beautifully done. And the difference between the two is that obviously the Van Gogh says so much more than the other. It does, the shoebox in the shoe store, they just want you to identify the shoe. That's all they're trying to do, so that you can get the right shoe. In the case of the Van Gogh, what's it about? It's about being a peasant. It's about tough work. It's about manual labor. It's about aching feet. It's about earth. It's about mud. And you never get to the end of it. That doesn't mean the painting can be about anything. No. There's a limit to that. You're not saying it can mean anything, but its meanings are multiple. It's saying there's a heck of a lot more to a pair of shoes than you think. And then when you, I don't know, go on, you get home after a rainy day or something, and there beside the door is a pair of shoes. So the familiar becomes unfamiliar. And that's one of the great ministries of art, it seems to me, is things you just pass by normally suddenly become laden with significance. A great landscape painter makes you look at this landscape you might have looked at for ages, but helps you see all sorts of things in it. Plays of color, forms overarching forms that you perhaps never noticed before, a kind of inner beauty that you never stop to consider, the familiar made unfamiliar. It's so the artist is adept at saying, it seems to me, there's more here than you think. There's always more than you could say, always more than you could articulate. The world has a kind of always moreness about it. Now, for Christians, it seems that's incredibly important because we want to say the world is not just one type of thing, but we also want to say there's more than the world. That is, that all this moreness is because there's a God at work in this world who's ever bringing new things out of this world. So that this world is not a closed system, it's open to God. It's not that the arts prove God's existence, I'm not saying that at all, but the very way they work keeps things open in a way that is theologically very friendly, Christianly very friendly, let's put it that way. So basically, that's a kind of long-winded answer. That's what the book's about. Baker, I don't know, it'll be out next year sometime. It's been fun. Well, fun. It's been a struggle to write because I've tried to do with a lot of scientific reductionism in the process. And I've also begun to see how many people appreciate the arts in very reductionist ways. A reductionist approach to the arts would be to say, what's the message of this painting? Tell me it in a statement. And then if you can't, it can't mean anything. That's reductionism. Reduce it to a statement, and there it is. It's what they call linguistic reductionism. If you can't reduce it to language, it can't be true. And that seems to be a profoundly dangerous thing to say and a ridiculous thing to say, because so many things we both know and appreciate and live into can never be expressed in language. And certainly not encapsulated in language or summed up in language, held in language, wonderful and important as language is. So that's basically it, Luke.
Incredible. Yeah. Well, that reminds me of another kind of maybe linguistic reductionism, which happens sometimes within worship or within worship music.
Yeah.
And even within the history of the Protestant church at various points, saying the only reason we allow arts or allow music into the church is for an educational or pedagogical reason, that it performs a function and it allows for theology to be spoken linguistically. And I would say that some of those strains are still alive and active in the church, that the arts have to justify their existence by virtue of their language.
I'm afraid that is, it's something I've written quite a bit about and still try to say I spend my life kind of shuffling between two extreme groups, though I'm sure you belong to none of them, nor at Biola would they do this. The one group that you might call as a kind of word-obsessed Protestantism, if you can't wrap it up in words and enclose it in a statement, it can't be true. That's a kind of extreme thing. So the minute you stop speaking, you're in terrible, terrible danger. That's the kind of truth. The other is a kind of what I call lazy aestheticism, which says something like, well, use words if you have to, but the sooner you can get away from language, the better. And then we can all just hold hands and sing hymns and without words or harmonize something in glorious resonance, but not use any language, because Christians eventually, need to escape language. That both of these seem to me very, very mistaken. That Christians glory in the language that God has given us, supremely the language of Scripture and supremely the language of Christ himself. But there's no claim that that language can enclose the realities that they speak about. And God's given us all these other modes of knowing, which I believe can be faithful to those texts, to those words, without having simply to ape them or without them having to be in precisely the same language. So we live, so to speak, inside Scripture, yes, looking at the world and living in the world, but we do so with music, for instance. So in a song or a hymn, if it's joyful words, you would expect something like joyful music. but it will be joyful in its own way. Thank you very much. Not in a linguistic way. It will be doing joyful things in a musical way. What's more, it may well be speaking of beauty and order in the very way it's designed. That's it. It's just going to do that whether you like it or not. And you have to say, well, that's interesting, because there it's expressing something which the words at that time don't explicitly express. Music's very good at doing that. It'll have a text, but it will tell you about all sorts of things that the text at that point is not telling you. So you can see what I'm trying to avoid is a kind of simple tying down music to words, kind of obsessively, and on the other saying, who cares about the words God's given us? The sooner we can get away from words, the better. That seems to me, no, we are to be faithful to the words God has given us, but faithful in different ways, faithful in musical, artistic, dramatic, even in dance ways. And we must rejoice in those ways. I realize that, of course, raises questions. Well, how do you know you're being really faithful? And so, well, that's the struggle. That's the struggle of being a Christian. How do we know? Sometimes it's hard to tell. Music, it's very interesting in the history of music. When music goes with words, the more, but this happens in the Reformation to a point, the more people try to get the music fitting like a glove to a hand, the more music will say, hey, I want to do something else as well as this, or I want to be music. I don't want to be words at this point. Thank you very much. I love what you're saying, but I'd like to say it in a musical way. Thank you very much. And so over and over again, music does its own thing. In the first, but very likely anyhow, in the early church, it would be very often a single syllable to every note. Very often that was regarded as the ideal. We don't actually know precisely, but that's called syllabic singing. But soon they managed to stretch a syllable over a note, over 2-3 notes, and then stretch more syllables over more notes. And what that does is the text now is very far from the way you would speak it, you see? That's because the music's doing its musical thing. It's making melodies. And that causes trouble for some minds. You see, that's music kind of asserting itself, and yet doing something glorious. If the psalm that it's setting is about joy in the Lord, hey, this is music doing joy in the Lord, thank you very much, but we'll do it in a musical way, please. And that means melodies, and perhaps much later, nice harmonies and all sorts of other things. And we need to respect that, I think. The Reformation struggled with this again and again and again. Much to learn from that.
There's even a sense that maybe that reductionism is based off of a fear of not having everything contained. So the
I think that's right.
Of allowing it to open up is, in fact, very parallel, if not the same, with a type of faith that God can hold it together.
Thank you. Golly, what a cue, because that's the culminating point of the introductory chapter, that common to most reductionism is a desire to control and master. You see, a reductionist who says the universe actually is nothing but these things, wow, they're in a powerful position, because once they know it's just these things, they have the view of the whole of reality. They think. Reductionism promises to put you into a very powerful position. If you can say it's all about psychology in the end, wow, and you're a psychologist, you're in a very powerful position, because that's all you need to rule the world is psychology. Of course, it's ridiculous, but it's that desire to control and master. And at the deepest level, that a reduction therefore is, well, no, let's put it the other way. At the highest level, reductionism is a way of saying, I have the overview of reality. Well, wait a minute. Who has the overview of reality? Only God. So the desire to control and master everything ultimately is that ancient sin of wanting to be God, of refusing our creatureliness, refusing our finitude. No, we want to be in that position where we can see everything as it really is. Mercifully, we don't. And because being God is a very exhausting business when you try it. But reductionism will try that. So I think that there is a thing there. And the glory of the gospel is that it releases us from that aspiration to have, to hold, and to seize, and to dominate. Just think of personal relations. You know, it's profoundly pathological, but incredibly complex. There's a great book, actually, I've just got it here, an author I would strongly recommend. He's a sociologist, not a Christian. It's by Rosa, German, and it's called The Uncontrollability of the World. It's one of the most Christian books I've read, in a sense that he's just reaching for a Christian view of the world. And he thinks the problem of modernity is the problem of control, and that we need to learn what he calls resonance with the world. It's short, it's very readable, and as a student of mine said to me the other day, it'll rock your world. So I just recommend. This is very, very much talked about these days. Rowan Williams, the theologian, this is one of his very key themes, that the kind of love that's built into God, the Trinitarian love, is a love that gives itself for the sake of the other and doesn't want to control the other in a closed circle or a closed relation. So we're down to the very deepest things here of who God is and who we are in relation to God. That's where reductionism, I find, a study of reduction takes you ultimately.